Spain is engaged in an asymmetrical or counterinsurgency war in Cuba, right? Spain is trying to suppress this rebellion by the Cubans. Spain has a lot of power, a lot of soldiers, a lot of firepower, and the Cubans just have handfuls of men fighting these hit and run ambush-like attacks. Um, since the Spanish soldiers cannot get at and then defeat the Cuban rebels, they tend to lash out at civilians, literally, carrying out executions of civilians or destructions of towns. And this is bad for kind of two reasons. One is it's morally wrong, but it's also a bad strategy. The Spanish are in danger of alienating the Cuban civilians, and they need to win them over in order to defeat the rebels. So the Spanish commander, General Weyler here, comes up with a new strategy, which he calls reconcentration. It's really concentration. He recognizes you have this problem where you have the Cuban civilian population is scattered amongst towns and villages up in the hills and jungles and fields, and mixed in amongst them are these rebels. So he takes military forces into various areas where the rebels have been active and rounds up all of the civilians, right? Takes all of the civilians out of the area, men, women, children, everybody who doesn't appear to be a rebel, and puts them into special fortified camps, concentrating the population in these camps. Hence, they become known as concentration camps. It's where we get the term. And the idea is these camps are going to be sort of fortified. So now the civilians are all here, safe and sound in these concentration camps, protected from the rebels and out of the way of the Spanish army. Now the Spanish army can pursue the rebels. It can destroy crops and villages without worrying about hurting anybody. Right? The strategy works pretty well. Within a couple of years, the rebels are all but defeated. There's just a few handful of people up in the hills struggling to survive, and the rebellion has more or less come to an end. Unfortunately, the Spanish army and the colonial administrators are focused and trained to deal with military aspects. They don't have really the budget or the organization to feed hundreds or thousands of people in these camps. And these camps are not well run, they're not well organized. And so there's bad water, people are concentrated, so somebody gets sick and it very rapidly spreads through the population of the camp. People are not getting fed the way they should. So you have malnutrition, disease is rampant, water is bad, so people have dysentery and other gastrointestinal disorders, and they begin to die. And so what was supposed to be a way of protecting and saving the civilians seems to be setting up the civilians for death, right? Which is not what's intended. It's accidental from the perspective of the Spanish. The American public are reading their newspapers, and they're reading about what's happening in Cuba as they are reading about what's happening around the world. It's just that Cuba is right in America's backyard, 70 miles off the coast of Florida. These are rebels trying desperately to free themselves and gain independence from a corrupt imperial power. And Americans feel a lot of sympathy for that. That's where America was in 1776, 77, 78, right? Fighting against England. But at the same time, Americans are, that's way over there. That's in Cuba. It's not my problem. It's a shame. It's a terrible shame. And maybe there's something we can do about it, but not really, because it's not our fight. So you've got Americans are watching this. They are emotionally moved by the struggles of the Cuban rebels and by the suffering of the Cuban civilians. And at the same time, we have to recognize, right, that industrialization has happened, including industrialization of the printing press and newspapers. Newspapers have been similarly industrialized, much like what we've already seen. Newspapers can be produced in very, very high numbers, rapidly producing lots and lots of pages for very little money. And not surprisingly, a few enterprising industrialists had developed newspaper corporations that controlled a variety of newspapers across the country, and they were making lots of money, and they were engaged in cutthroat competition with each other. Right. So, for example, and this is the big one, you have William Randolph Hearst in this corner, right? And in this corner, well, up above him is Joseph Pulitzer, right? This is William Randolph Hearst, one of the richest men in America. He's famous, of course, for Hearst Castle along the coast. If you get a chance to visit it, it's well worth a day. It's pretty remarkable. He almost went broke building it, but that's a whole nother story. Pulitzer, you've probably heard of, because eventually he puts money into the Pulitzer Prize to reward excellent journalism. In the 1890s, we did not have excellent journalism. We had what was known as yellow journalism, or the yellow press, right? That's the yellow press. Yellow journalism, or the yellow press, refers to a form of newspaper and media that focuses on creating an emotional response in the reader by being utterly sensationalistic, maybe lying, or at least using hyperbole and exaggerating things, maybe occasionally making things up. It's not designed to inform you, to let you learn about the world around you. It is designed to scare you or shock you into buying a newspaper and buying another newspaper. And you need to know more because you're horrified or titillated or whatever by this. It's bad journalism. Why is it called yellow journalism? Well, the theory is it's this guy's fault. This is one of the early color comics of the late 19th century. He's called the Yellow Kid. Hence, he's in yellow, and he was a single panel comic strip. And somehow the Yellow Kid got associated with this form of journalism during this period. That Pulitzer and Hearst are trying desperately to drive one another out of business, gain as much of the market in the newspaper business that they can by writing things in their newspapers that aren't particularly true, but will get people to buy newspapers. Right? And Hearst was doing this very consciously. He understood that most Americans were sympathetic to the Cubans, and he played on that. He hired, for example, Frederic Remington, one of the great illustrators and painters of the late 19th century in the United States. If you've seen any illustrations of cowboys, you've pretty much seen work by Frederic Remington. And he hired this illustrator to go to Cuba and draw pictures of the evil things that the evil Spanish were doing to the kind and peace-loving Cubans, right? You can tell from my tone of voice, hopefully, that this wasn't reality, but that's what he wanted in the newspapers. Most, your average middle class white American was already pretty biased against Spanish and Hispanic people. So that played into it. And Pulitzer, not to quite the same extent, but to a similar extent, was blowing things all out of proportion and trying to get Americans to really pay attention to this war. Now, Frederic Remington goes to Havana and he finds there isn't much going on. It's rather quiet, in part because General Weyler's strategy of concentration seems to be working. And Frederic Remington sends a telegram to Hearst. I'm falling all over myself here, saying no war here, send instructions. And supposedly Hearst sent a telegram back saying, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Stay in your hotel room, make up things, make up pictures about the evil Spanish doing all sorts of evil, lascivious things, nasty things, and we will get a war going. Okay. So you can see you've got Pulitzer here is pushing back and forth on the war with Hearst. And so this yellow journalism creates an environment amongst many Americans that's pushing them towards war. War sells newspapers, and certainly Hearst understood this. If America got involved in a war, he could sell a lot of newspapers. So now finally, after all of this, we're finally on the edge of the Spanish-American War and how it comes about, right? So that is the topic that we turn to here. Oh, there it is. The Spanish-American War. We're finally going to look at it. Now, you've got all of this going on in Cuba, right? You've got the Spanish army is there fighting against the Cuban rebels, engaged in this policy of reconstruction. Civilians are dying. The newspapers are playing this all up in the media. You also have the wars damaging some American properties. There were American businessmen and corporations who owned different forms of plantations and other businesses in Cuba that were occasionally getting damaged either by the Spanish army or by the Cubans. And so those businesses were putting pressure on President McKinley, right? President William McKinley got elected back in 1896, right? We saw him running running in that election against the populists. And they want McKinley to intervene somehow and stop the war from damaging American interests. And you have also a few Americans who have gotten in trouble with the Spanish smuggling weapons in to support the Cubans. And they're saying, hey, Mr. President, come and help us here. Come and save us. William McKinley is uninterested personally in starting a war. He had served during the American Civil War as a United States Army officer and basically thought war was very bad. It is not something that you want. You should avoid going to war, particularly when there doesn't appear to be much of a reason for it. Right? Nevertheless, he felt like he needed to do something. And there are a few people on his cabinet in his administration who are interested in provoking a war with Spain because they know that the United States can get territory, that it can gain access to new colonies and bases, right? So McKinley sends a US Navy battleship down to Havana, the USS Maine, right? This is one of these pretty new battleships, new ships that the Navy has, right? You can tell it's all steam powered here. It's got a number of really massive guns. It's hard to tell here, but this is a big turret with giant guns on it. This is an example of what is sometimes called gunboat diplomacy. You send, in some cases, a literal gunboat, this battleship, down to fly the flag and just let the foreign governments know we're here, you know, we're not up to anything, but we're watching you. We've got our eyes on you. So don't try any funny stuff. They're there to essentially project power and to, hello, um, uh, to let everybody know that the United States is watching, right? And McKinley figures this is just kind of a gesture. He'll send the ship down there. It'll stay in Havana Harbor, drop anchor. The sailors will go on shore leave in Cuba. They'll have a nice time for a few days, and then it'll come home, and that'll be that. But one evening, while part of the crew is being entertained in Havana by a huge ball that's being put on by the officers of the Spanish Navy as a gesture towards their fellow officers and sailors in the American Navy. And there's an explosion on board the ship, on board the USS Maine. Indeed, there appear to be two explosions. There's kind of a boom, kaboom, right? A sort of muffled, smaller explosion followed very shortly, almost instantly, by a tremendous earth-shattering explosion. 250 American sailors are killed. The ship immediately, breaks into two and basically settles on the bottom of the harbor with just its superstructure sticking up out of the water. Immediately, all of the ships in the harbor, including all the Spanish Navy ships, send over lifeboats to try and rescue anyone they possibly can. And so Americans are shocked by this. A couple hundred Americans killed. What has happened here? So McKinley sends down a committee, an investigative committee, to discover what happened. And if you will, forensic study of explosions and accidents is in its infancy. And a lot of the work that the investigation does is pretty good. But at the same time, they don't seem to get some of their evidence correct. Okay? What they argue, they come back and they say, all right, you've got this big turret right here with guns in it. Below that is the ammo bunker. Is an ammo bunker with the explosive gunpowder and explosive shells that are in there, right? And then they're hoisted up to be fired from the guns up here. The investigation says, we think there was an external explosion, and that was the initial boom. And that was right below or right next to the ammo bunker, which then blew up all of the ammo all at once in a tremendous explosion. And they point to the bending of certain steel plates and so forth. What is this external explosion? The main guess is it's a mine. And then the question becomes, well, was this deliberately planted or was this accidental? And you have to realize there were mines, these sort of primitive explosives used for defensive purposes in many places around the world. And occasionally those things got loose and they sort of floated around and bumped into stuff and blew up. So that's a possibility. But maybe somebody planted a bomb, right, underneath the ship. Who would do that? Suspicion immediately falls on the Spanish, right? Not the Cubans, but the Spanish. There's no evidence really for anybody who did it, but that becomes the suspicion. Since 1898, there have been about half a dozen investigations that went back to Havana and studied the wreckage, including at least one by National Geographic. And they all, shall we say, threw shade on the original 1898 investigation. Most of them found evidence that it was not an external explosion that set off the ammo bunker. It was an internal explosion, probably from the coal bunker that was next to it. Remember, these are coal ships. And you have this big space where you keep all of this coal because it has to be shoveled into the boilers. You may not realize this, but coal actually gives off a gas that can build up. And if it builds up to a certain pressure and there's a spark, boom, right? Coal blows up. And that was a chronic problem on Navy ships. Around the world was this buildup of coal gas. And so the belief is that was probably what caused it, that it was simply an accident of bad maintenance, caused the explosion here, which triggered the explosion here, which sank the ship. And the commander of the USS Maine had already gotten in trouble before on that exact issue. Okay? So in all likelihood, this was an accident. There's no real evidence that anybody planted a bomb to blow up the ship. Nevertheless, the newspapers, of course, run with that, particularly the New York Journal, right? William Randolph Hearst announces Spanish treachery. The Spanish stabbed us in the back by blowing up our ship. He doesn't have evidence for it, but what more evidence do you need than the Spanish are evil people, according to his perspective, right? So now we're set up for some sort of conflict. Newspapers are pushing the president to go to war. The president's cabinet is pushing the president to go to war. There are congressmen who are saying, well, we should probably declare war. And McKinley doesn't want to go to war. He feels that this is a bad idea, but he does agree to try and intervene in some fashion. So he announces, hey, we're going to do negotiations. He talks to Spain and says, I have negotiators to meet with you and help bring the Cubans and the Spanish together and end this destructive war and have everybody, come together as peaceful and create some sort of new Cuba out of all of this. The Spanish kind of go, no, we've already won the war. There's no war to have a peace treaty over, right? The war is over. We don't want to give up anything. Gradually, they finally realize, okay, we have to do something here. And so the Spanish agree to negotiations, but when they do, it's already too late. A couple of things happened. One is, turned out the Spanish ambassador was writing letters back to the Spanish government, basically saying, this McKinley guy, he's really nice, but he's just a big doofus. He's not very smart. He might be kind of cowardly. He's not going to go to war, so we can kind of push him around. Oddly enough, that's exactly what William Randolph Hearst was saying about McKinley, until Hearst finds out about these letters. He gets his hand on them, and they are published. And Hearst now starts saying, the Spanish have insulted us. Nobody can call our president a worthless doofus, but Americans. The other thing, so on the one hand, we have been insulted. Our president has been personally insulted. Number two, the Cuban rebels changed their position. The Cuban rebels had initially said, no, thank you. We don't want American involvement. That's a bad idea. They figured that if America gets involved in the war, then America's just going to take over. And they didn't want that. So Congress passes a special bill, the Teller Amendment, right? It's named for Congressman Teller. And it's an amendment to a bill. It's an amendment to another bill, not to the Constitution. Right? And the Teller Amendment says, the United States promises that it has no territorial ambitions in Cuba, and if it goes to war with Spain, we will give Cuba its total independence. That's our goal. And with that written, and it passes both houses and it's approved by the president, now the Cuban rebels go, okay, if you're really going to be on our side and not trying to just take our land, sure, join us. And 6 days later, Congress declares war on April 25th. And we get a war with a great motto, right? Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. So now we're going to war. And so we declare war on April 25th. The first battle is going to be on May 1st. Literally within days, America wins its first battle in Manila Bay. All right, so the Battle of Manila Bay, just a few days after declaring war. I'm going to stop this here and I'll pick this up in our next section. Ask yourself, or maybe you look it up, where is Manila Bay? That's your homework for now.